Thanks, David. We're excited too. We'll start in just a few more seconds. It looks like some people are still funneling in. Okay. So good evening and welcome. My name is Michael Piper, and I'm the director of the Master of Urban Design program here at Daniels. Also joining us from the Daniels faculty today are Alex Sheinbaum in her second year of the Master of Landscape Architecture program, Ophelia Lan in her second year of the Master of Architecture program, and Phat Lay, also in her Master of Architecture program and in his final year. I'm delighted to host this evening's joint presentation by the School of Cities and the Daniels faculty, the 99% Invisible City. We love collaborating with School of Cities, who brought this event forward. Joining us today are podcasters and authors of the 99% Invisible City, Roman Mars and Kurt Kohlstedt. Welcome. I now invite our Dean Rob Wright to deliver a land acknowledgement.
Good evening, everybody. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to this land. Daniels honors Indigenous peoples past, present, and future here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those on the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. Now back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Rob. So before we begin, I wanted to remind the audience that you can submit your questions at any time during the event using the Q&A function on Zoom. And also a recording of this event will be posted on the Daniels website following the event. It's now my great pleasure to introduce you to Roman Mars and Kurt Kohlstedt, host and digital director of the renowned podcast 99% Invisible. We are fortunate to have them here today to speak about their book, 99% Invisible City. As a collection of stories, as they describe, is a field guide to the hidden world of everyday design. I'm especially excited to have them here because as academics, when we speak about design or learn to be designers, we're often focused on what I'll call headliners, the big, magical, iconic projects that make it onto postcards, into history books, and become cemented in our idea of place. I'm personally interested in the underdogs that never make it onto postcards, the strip malls, corner stores, outhouses, and double-hung windows that shape so much of our world, but for their ubiquity, so often go unnoticed. The 99% Invisible City tells us stories of our city's unsung heroes. It's about the spaces in between the museums and monuments where design happens in weird and sometimes unintended ways. Roman and Kurt, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
So today, we're going to start with a few general questions from me to you guys. And then after that, the students will rejoin us and we'll have some more pointed questions about specific topics in the book. So this should be fun. So I'll get started. Roman, you started this as a solo endeavor, podcasting from your home. So what made you think that this subject matter, the kind of invisible everyday, would resonate with listeners?
I mean, mainly because it resonated with me. And so when you're making something, especially like something like a podcast, you're your first audience, especially when you're alone and you have no other employees. So I was interested in these little details, and I thought that it would be something that would work in little short stories in particular, because it was really made to be a drop-in during morning edition during National radio broadcast in San Francisco, and it was 4 minutes long, and it was just about one little thing. And I thought that stories about mundane things would work really well in that like tight format. And so, yeah, it's just sort of like I did it for me, essentially.
Did it take a while for it to like, catch on, or was it, yeah, I'm curious
No,
at how,
it did well on the air here, or it got noticed. And then, what happened at that point, like I'd already been in radio for a good 10 years. And so a lot of people I knew were working and running shows. And so when it was first came out as a podcast, people like Jesse Thorne promoted it. He does an NPR show called Bullseye. Jadab Murad, who I knew from, actually, no, we went to the same college actually. And I knew from working, and they promoted it. And so it found an audience pretty quickly through other people who had established shows at the time.
wonderful. It's tricky, I find, to sometimes get people excited about these things. So I think it's wonderful that you guys have managed to do so.
Well, and that is a little bit has to do with how we, the way I conceived of the tone of it, the why it has this sort of intimate, quiet tone, was that I knew that saying we're going to do a show about manhole covers is not going to really like get people going. But I thought from the beginning that I would mic it in such a way that it would have a tone of your inside monologue, and a little bit of a person who's putting their arm around their shoulder and going like, oh no, like really, this is cool, like pay attention to this, instead of a really announcer or authoritative tone. And so that was a little bit part of the design from the beginning, to overcome the fact that I knew that it was going to be a show about boring things.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the design of it, though. That's great.
Yeah.
So we actually have a question. So Roman from the David Estrin's asking how you got into podcasting. Was there anything before the show, or did you sort of jump in with the show?
Oh, there was a lot. So I worked in public radio for 10 years before this show started. And so I worked on every type of public radio show that existed, storytelling shows, news shows, public affairs shows. And 99PI was the show I was kind of making for myself as I was working on multiple shows simultaneously. I wanted to get back into hosting. I hadn't done that in a while. I wanted to do more writing. I wanted to do, it was the show I was crafting for myself. And at the time, podcasting wasn't what you would consider an industry. It was kind of a extension, a hobby of maybe some professional broadcasters, but it wasn't really an industry. And so I just put it as a podcast because it seemed like a convenient way to get my friends to listen to it. And that was basically it. But yeah, I was just a person who was in love with radio and wanted to be involved in radio from years and years and years ago.
So Kurt, one thing I can't help wondering when I listened to your show or read the book is how you all are thinking about your audiences. Do you imagine somehow that you're kind of crafting a way of seeing the world, and do you see or do you have a kind of desire that listeners or readers might see the world differently after listening or reading?
Yeah, I mean, especially with this book, I like on some level, this book operates as a guide to seeing the world differently. And so like you're learning about specific things, you're reading specific stories, but there's a trajectory to it. And the hope is that by the end of it, you're noticing things you haven't noticed before, or thinking about things in a different way. And I mean, I came at this whole thing from a different angle, right? Like I wrote about design for a long time after studying design for a couple of years. And so when I was in grad school, I wasn't the best at studio, but I loved researching things. And I loved telling my friends about things I was learning in architecture school. And so I just became fascinated with this kind of translation work of like, how can I make this thing that I'm learning about interesting to somebody who is maybe not, or doesn't think they're interested in architecture or built environments?
No, I mean, it's super interesting to hear you speak about, seeing the world differently, and being a designer, of course, like once you get into the kind of nuts and bolts of making things or imagining things, you start to notice things differently in the world. So it makes a lot of sense. Honestly, I knew I read it, but I'd forgotten that you had gone to architecture school. It is Roman who doesn't have the design degree.
That's right.
That's right. He cheated. I was shocked when I learned that, by the way. I was like, you studied biology?
Oh,
How? Because the first time I heard the show, I was like, oh, this guy's an architect. Like, this guy is definitely a domain expert. But yeah.
Oh, that's great.
I fake it well.
So maybe a kind of question for either of you, however you want to approach it. But in your words, the 99% invisible is about all of the thought that goes into the things we don't think about, which, by the way, very well written. What drew you to these things that we don't think about? Why are they so important?
I just think it's fun more than anything. I mean, I think like learning a little mystery of an everyday thing is like, I also think that it's sort of like, it's always how I've been wired and how I've enjoyed storytelling or enjoyed the stories. But like, we also kind of hit a moment when I think that the internet was also really interested in these types of things, like smaller details, like the oral history of one episode of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is something that you will see on the internet today, which didn't exist, 10 years ago. And I think that kind of deep dive specific into the specificity of something is something that I think lights up the imagination in an interesting way. And I think a few people tapped into it, like your James Burke and, type like with connections, like tapped into these things. And they were a little niche, but for the most part, they were only niche because they didn't hit a big enough audience. But like and it's clear that when the proliferation of like whole channels devoted to restoring furniture or something like that, like people love the sort of like careful examination of details and all these things. And so that itch is there. Like everyone is that type of nerd if you present it to them about some type of thing. And so I think that we just kind of hit at a moment when that type of storytelling, became the coin of the realm, and it's, and it just is. So I kind of think it's how everyone's wired. And that's why, again, the intimacy with which I present to the audience and talk to the audience, is that sense that like, I'm not here to convince you that you're into this stuff. I know you're into this stuff, like we start from that premise and then it kind of goes from there. Yeah. Especially with design. Like I started noticing that people were arguing about fonts on movie posters and stuff like this. And this is something that didn't happen before 10 years ago, really at all, except for very, very small communities of people. And so the internet really facilitated this type of discussion.
Maybe a question for Kurt, on a related note is I'm curious about the kind of research process that you guys, go through, or, when, what brings about a story? Do you sort of see something and wonder and research, or does it come from like, something you read about somewhere, or how do you research what you research?
I mean, it's really all over the map, and I kind of love that. I've designated myself the guy who checks the inbox for story ideas from listeners, and it's full all the time. And so there's like a lot of sorting to be done there. But I kind of take a first pass and say, okay, is this something that other producers might be interested in making into a show? Or maybe it's just a mini story, and we do collections of shorter stories sometimes. Or maybe it's just an article for the website. But I like having that first pass so that I can, try to segment these things out. And sometimes they'll collect over time. I'll be like, okay, this is the third person who's written about this. Maybe I need to look into it, right? And then, of course, it's always kind of weirdly nice when somebody writes in and pitches you something you've already done, because it makes you think, okay, well, we figured the audience out. They're into this. And all I have to do is just be like, hey, by the way, we covered that. Here's a link.
Yeah.
but it comes from, all the people on the staff throw ideas into different channels, fans. I mean, and sometimes it's like a recall thing where it's like, I've read about this before, and here's an update and a reason to maybe cover it now.
Mm-hmm. Kurt's also like a really good researcher, just so you know. It's. I mean, it's like the range of sources, especially the book is like this treasure trove of the bibliography is really a beautiful thing. Like it's actually one of my favorite parts of the book, to tell you the truth, because I look through it and just like my uncle bought the book and he was like, the bibliography is really impressive. You guys clearly didn't make this stuff up. Like, the research is Kurt's research in particular is impeccable. Like from secondary sources and articles, all the way from reading the MUTCUD, the municipal codes for signages and stuff like that. We sort of run the gamut when we're sourcing things.
No, I mean, and it shows. I have to say, one of the most pleasurable things is to kind of, you'll be hearing a story and then, more detail and more detail.
Yeah.
I really want to ask a question about the relationship between the Guggenheim and post office boxes in rural areas, but I'm watching the time, and I'd like to bring our students back to maybe dig in to the book a little bit. So welcome again to Alex, Phat, and Ophelia. So we asked each of them to pick a chapter and then pick a thing from a chapter. And these, of course, are the images behind us, are the things we picked. Well, I didn't get to. I just really like the dancing inflatable guys. But
they are really.
They're amazing.
That is totally fair.
And the story is good too. So they've each come up with a question or so. So I'm gonna hand it over to Alex, who's gonna start us up. It looks like Alex might be frozen, so I think we'll. Yeah, we're gonna skip to Ophelia and come back to Alex. Ophelia.
Okay, hopefully that works itself out. So in the chapter on urbanism, you tell the story of how a group of disabled activists fought for the creation of curb cuts at pedestrian intersections, those little ramps from the road to the sidewalk. This is a very spatial and concrete example of how citizen action produced change in the urban fabric. However, as you mentioned, the Americans with Disabilities Act leaves a lot of ambiguity for interpretation, especially in providing access for those with less visible disabilities. It would be great to hear your thoughts on activism. Have you come across other ways that activists engage central authority to change the built environment?
Yeah, I mean, the book sort of culminates into that chapter on urbanism that really is about the conversation between, bottom-up interventionists and top-down, design thought when it comes to a city. And activism is a huge part of it, and some of it, has that look and feel of activism, like the Rolling Quads did in Berkeley, which led to some of the curb cut stuff. And some of it is kind of playful and kind of doesn't have that same sort of like quite the same sort of force of like taking on a certain subject in particular. It's a lot has to do with just the reclamation of space, in a kind of more abstract way. What I love about that story in particular, and I think is a good example, is them using a sledgehammer to smash up the corner of a sidewalk to make the first curb cuts in their area and then concrete to smooth it out. If you talk to the activists present, they're like, I don't know, we did it maybe once or twice. You know what I mean? Like wasn't really the thing that they made that was all that important. It was the statement that what they made that was important. And so when it comes to engaging with the built environment, really small physical changes, if they have the right message, can have a huge effect. And this totally had a gigantic effect. And so I think that's one of the lessons, and that acting locally, making a big deal of something, doing something in physical space so that people can, especially today, take pictures, revel in its cleverness, like present it to the world, can do so much. And you don't need to like put a sledgehammer to every single, curb, like in Berkeley to make it happen. You can do it in a small scale and have it have a big effect.
I mean, yeah, one of my favorite small examples of this from the book is a guy in Toronto, actually, put some leaves out in the street and chalked some outlines. Really simple intervention, right? Really low tech, simple intervention. But he concluded from this that we could extend the curbs and reclaim, 2,000 square feet of space. Now, that doesn't sound like a huge deal, but this thing went viral. It inspired other people to do similar things in their cities. And so, yeah, a lot of this, especially in the digital age, is about like, you can make a statement, take a picture, take a video, and inspire other people to do the same thing or something similar, or to at least rethink their own space.
And I think the incompleteness of access, like the that it's not done, is an important point and needs to be sort of like thought about a lot, and know that, what makes a city what it is this conversation between these different constituencies, and that conversation just continually has to happen. And the more that, like the interventionists can like poke holes and speak out and do things, it's really important to continue to move the conversation forward, because it's the change. The city needs to adapt to be what we need it to be. And I think that my hope and what I sort of feel is inclusivity and equity is becoming more part of the dominant, like value system, and the cities need to reflect that.
And I guess those are all very like physical and concrete examples, and kind of speaking about equity. A positive income of COVID has been the increased virtual accessibility of programming and events. Do you see this continuing beyond the pandemic and enabling new forms of activism that are more online or virtual?
I mean, it's sort of, time will tell in some ways. It's like hard to say. My guess is yes. I mean, my guess is that the nature of both, distributed work and communities, we've learned that we can do this, and not, I mean, I think there's some reaction of like, if I never get on Zoom again, it'll be too soon type of thing. But I also get the sense that, like, as a person who runs a business and 13 people work for me, not a single one of them, they quickly spread across the United States when they had that ability. And I think that once you kind of figure that out, it's kind of hard to put that genie back into the bottle. And so I hope that the good parts of that, when it comes to accessibility, is, gets taken along with it, and not just convenience.
So Alex has rejoined us, thankfully, after a slight pause. So maybe we'll let you take the next one.
Oh, thank you. Hi, everyone. Hi, Kurt. Great to speak with you guys. In this section about water infrastructure, there's a focus on how cities render invisible processes like hydrology more evident through cosmetic application. Some examples from the book are the manhole covers from Seattle.
Oh, Alex, I think we've got some audio difficulties.
I think we're catching enough. If you keep going, I think we're catching enough. Unless you're totally first.
Sorry, I tried muting it and then unmuting it to see if.
Oh, sounds better.
You sound so much better.
Perfect. That was the robot mode, but she's back. She's back.
So
Please.
The manhole covers from Japan and Seattle, along with the greening of the Chicago River during St. Patrick's Day to kind of render hydrology visible in the city. Is there a role that these cosmetic applications might play in light of the larger environmental challenges such as flooding? And or are these kinds of distance interactions misleading or superficial?
I mean, one of the projects that I got into a few years ago in San Francisco, it was, I think it was called Ghost Streams, and it was an art installation that basically they laid out on the sidewalks and the streets where rivers were buried in the city. And I mean, that in and of itself is maybe a sort of superficial action, but it does I mean, it gets you asking questions like, well, why did we bury those? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? And it turns out, and we talk about this a bit in another part of the book, it's kind of a bad thing. It's a bad thing for ecosystems. It's a bad thing for people. It's not great to bury all of our waterways. And so now there's a lot of daylighting going on. And so I think to the extent that you can raise awareness, and there's other things too, like little fish stickers to remind you that this water, is going into a stream. Sometimes you'll see those along the sidewalk. I think those things can be a gateway to, remind people of what's going on below us, and then a pivot point for when, we actually need to change and fix these kinds of urban mistakes we've made over time.
Yeah, I co-sign to that. I think for the most part, I get that. Like, I don't know what greening the river in Chicago does for to raise awareness of hydrology, but I do think that the idea that the maintenance covers being done to sort of exalt in the glory of infrastructure, which was their point in Japan, is really something that is worth it. And I do think that type of approach when it comes to making small moments of joy and curiosity go a long way towards tackling big problems, and that big problems are kind of hard for us to get our arms around sometimes. And so even though when you think about the relationship between cities and water, which is part of why cities are the way they are and how they function, and this is going to be hugely fraught over the next couple hundred years, it might seem minor to just to worry too much about the design of maintenance covers, but I do feel like they're the start of a conversation about ownership and excitement about the things we build together, because when it comes to this is a problem we have to solve together, and I think that inspiring those things is important.
And without something on the surface, they are literally the most invisible things in the world, right?
Yeah.
I mean, literally buried underground where you can't see them. So, as a starting point, giving it some kind of superficial expression, it gives us a place to start having a conversation about it.
Yeah.
And I have a bit of a follow-up question as well. Given our current climate crisis and is putting a lot of pressures on us as designers and taking action in the built form, and you kind of briefly addressed the oyster texture project in Manhattan by Scape. And I was curious about your thoughts on, should it be a given today that designers endeavor to address these challenging issues, such as the climate crises, with their work?
I say emphatically yes. In my second term in grad school, we took a course on sustainability and design, and every term we also had a studio. And I remember them telling me, well, we used to pair the course in the studio so that you learned about these things and then tried them out in the studio. But then we found all the designs kind of looked the same. But they looked the same for a reason, because the students were incorporating sustainability and designing around that. So I thought that was kind of backward, and I pushed back on it. And they were like, no, you're letting sustainability drive your design too much. I'm like, I think that's kind of a really important thing to have drive your design a lot. So to me, it should be at the forefront of design education. It should be at the forefront of designers' minds. Buildings, take up a huge amount of energy. And to me, that needs to be the baseline. That should be part of the toolbox of constraints that informs every design.
Yeah, same. Of course, I don't have to do the work, so it's easy for me to say. But future designers, get your act together, guys.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll move on to another future designer who certainly has his act together. It's Phat Lay.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. So I looked at the first chapter, Inconspicuous, and focused on this section on the section on camouflage. where the book explores the use of camouflage and infrastructure through monumental stink pipes, wireless towers that look like trees, like I just banged my head on a shelf. I didn't see the shelf here. Oh boy. The wireless towers that look like trees, and electrical substations that disguise themselves as residential homes. What stands out in this chapter, camouflage, is that it seems like the opposite of everything else in this book. While most of the book focuses on the invisible things, with this chapter, the focus is on things that are designed to be visible or to play an optical trick. Do you see this chapter as an exception, or how do you see the relationship to the others?
Well, the whole chapter is about sort of inconspicuous things, and there's it's sort of divided, as you notice, between things that are inconspicuous because they're ubiquitous and small, and we just, our brains, like eliminate them from our visual field because we see them so often we don't care, and then and then it moves into that section, which are things that are inconspicuous because we've designed them to be inconspicuous because for some reason we find, whatever function they're actually serving as somehow, offensive to our aesthetic sensibilities, And so the chapter really does flow. And this is something that, like Kurt and I spent forever on, this idea of like how things kind of flow together and they tell a bigger story. And into this area because, like it kind of starts with those cell phone towers that look like trees, into whole, like industrial islands that look kind of like future cities, and there was like, I think 3 other sections
there were it went really I mean, we went really big at one point and we had to kind of cut it back. I ended up writing an article about some of the things we cut, but we went into Potemkin villages, like entire fake towns, and we realized we were kind of getting away from cities at that point.
Yeah.
And so we really chopped a big chunk out of that section.
We kind of, and to me, the stuff about camouflage, in addition to the inconspicuous, and the reason why it's kind of first is it's the first kind of love of a field guide to hidden things, is like, let's, like, here, we're going to give you the tools to find things that you don't notice. And that's the first kind of, easy, joyful kind of step, is stuff that's the ground level, that's easy to see. And we'll tell you some fun stories so that you'll never not notice those little squiggly utility marks again, and cell phone towers, and they get kind of bigger and more grand in their way. Yeah, I don't really think of it as an outlier. It's just part of the the camouflage stuff. It was just a continuum. It was getting to be an outlier. That's why we kind of
it got really long. Yeah. No, like I think of the whole first chapter, and to some extent the whole first 2 chapters, which are also the shortest ones, as being like a primer for the rest of the book. Like they're setting you up to like be like, oh, okay, I get what this book is going to be about. I'm starting to notice things differently, and then we get into the real meat of things where we talk about architecture and infrastructure and geography. But to me, like, it's like we kind of front loaded some of the fun, easy to get things people could relate to and notice, to get you in the mindset, so you're ready for like the rest of the book.
And then each chapter kind of goes like a different view, like a kind of a building level view, a city level view, and then like a landscape view, and then we wrap it up with that urbanism section. So it's meant to all kind of speak to each other and flow in that kind of way.
Thank you. Yeah, like I think like just sort of to follow up on that, like I guess like of course, like I guess the goal of the camouflage seems to try to hide this infrastructure, or try to blend it in, but for many of the examples that you showed, like the effects seem to do sort of the opposite, in my opinion. Like I kept thinking of it almost like it's sort of like dragging like the sort of like pieces of infrastructure, like the point isn't to fool the audience, but something else. Like it's a man in a wig, like it's there, but then it's like, what's it, like what's the point of it? And I guess like I want to ask, like, do you find a certain delight or pleasure in the uncanniness of these sort of like thinly veiling camouflage?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
The ugliness of those trees is almost like 90% of their pleasure. You know what I mean? And it's not even so much that, and I think that what I find most interesting about camouflage, or like the the Toronto, like the hydroelectric, conversion houses and all those sorts of things is not so much what they look like in and of themselves, but how they represent our values of the time when they were considered completely necessary to get this type of infrastructure built. And so that's what I like about it. I mean, that's what's fun about it. And yeah, some of its awkwardness is part of the joy. That's what I don't know. That's what just tickles me personally. Yeah, for sure.
And somewhat ironically too, with the advent of the internet, everybody knows now, like, where the fake facade is in London or the one in New York. Yeah. So, these things that were meant to be camouflaged and be kind of hidden from view are now, like, they just go viral online. So they become the opposite of this intended disguise and become rather popular instead.
I'd be remiss not to point out the chapter or the one of the subjects in the book, the hydro stations in Toronto. It's something we're all kind of familiar with here, and actually of all the camouflage types, it's one of the more subtle ones. It's only when you kind of know what you're looking at that it really starts to irk you. It's a kind of a different version than the the palm trees.
It is, and Australia, the east coast of Australia has a lot of those as well, and they're also getting deprecated, and they're also turning into other regular housing because there's the kind of the needs for it. Like the facade of it is more valuable than the junk inside of it because now the technology has just moved on, and so I find that stuff really, really fun. You pretend to be a house long enough, you eventually become a house.
Yeah.
Okay, and actually, I think we're doing okay on time. And I had one more question before we start to take some questions from the audience. And it's this kind of question about the Guggenheim I mentioned earlier. So, and your podcast and books include stories of both lowbrow, everyday things like rural post office buildings, for example. However, you also discuss high-end, big-name design. So, Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim is in your book, and I wonder, or at least it's a podcast.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, do you distinguish between high and low design? And if so, how do you see? If not, or how so? How do you see that relationship, or how do you approach them differently?
Well, I never wanted this show to be a show about fancy designers, to tell you the truth. Like, we don't tend to do those things unless it really tells a different type of story. And we, like the Guggenheim was an interesting thing because it was a commission. Like the Guggenheim people were like, would you do this for us? And I was interested in it, but the tone of it is like, I tend to bring it down to the type of mailbox design type stuff that you talk about. So like, I didn't talk about the Guggenheim museum's place in architecture a whole lot. I talked about the lumpy parapets and the thing in the fact that the color is different than it used to be and all that sort of stuff. So I tend to bring it down to the little details because I find those more fascinating. But I wanted to tie it to the theme of organic architecture in a way, but not make it about the isms of architecture. Like the show has never been about those things. And so I do kind of, I guess I tend to always put the joy and the way that we tell the stories of design and mediate those things is through the personal experience and not through the large movements of architecture and their ripple effect a whole lot. I mean, we'll touch on them, and there's no one way to tell any type of story. And we have no real formula for that sort of stuff. But I tend to tell only, like, even if it is a big grand thing that has significance, it tends to be the style of talking about manhole covers and mailboxes too. And I think that's what makes it kind of fun. I mean, I went to the Guggenheim people and I just said, listen, this is how I'm going to do it. If you don't want it, then, just be prepared for that. And so I kind of, at the very beginning, I just sort of dispense with the idea of the building's greatness and its influence and just say, okay, we're going to take that as a given. And then we're going to talk about all the imperfections that make it a building that's changed over time and how you can experience it. And that was kind of the point.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of think of it like we reverse the typical approach of, you know, saying, here, we're going to talk about modernism, and then here we're going to talk about this building. It's more, oh, we found a cool story about this building and its relationship to this character. And oh, by the way, we'll mention some things about modernism. But but you know, that's like, that story has been told, right? Like how that building fits in the canon is been told. It's much more interesting if we can come at it from different angles. So like, for example, our stories on Frank Lloyd Wright are not about, you know, typically about his most famous buildings, but we have a pair on Usonia, which a lot of people are less familiar with than, you know, for example, Falling Water. So a lot of these things we kind of come at sideways. I mean, I can tell you there's like an episode about all of the isms, but it's not really about those isms in each case.
Right.
I mean, that's the thing about, you know, one of the most interesting things about Frank Lloyd Wright is he got really upset when people put shoes in the wrong place. Like he would visit a client's house and see shoes weren't in the proper cubby and have a hissy fit or something. So I don't know, I found that story particularly interesting just because it does put architecture in the kind of space of daily life. So
yeah.
I thought we might take a few questions from the audience. We've got a huge pile of them now, and maybe a couple of our students can relay them to you all.
Yeah, so I'll start off with a question from Willem. He asked, I'd love to hear your thoughts about balancing the protection and commemoration of heritage buildings and spaces with designing for the needs of our present and future communities.
The hardest question in all of architecture.
I mean, balance is the right word there, honestly, is what it comes down to. A lot of the time we, you know, when we do a show, you know, we kind of come down to the fact of like, okay, it kind of depends. You know what I mean? Like that's sort of the thoughtful response. I can tell you, I don't know if Kurt, you have a good answer for this right away, but I can tell you where I'm swimming in it.
I mean, I don't have a great answer for it. I mean, we have a whole section on this, and we sort of talk about different ways that people, you know, reuse old buildings or adapt old buildings or let old buildings fall apart or replace old buildings. And we really kind of walk through the whole spectrum of possibilities, but it really is contextual too. It's like if there is a real need for housing in the middle of an urban area, I'm less inclined to say, well, we need to preserve this thing. But it's hard. It's a hard thing, and it's very case by case. I think I used to lean more towards preservation, and now I think I have leaned towards skepticism of preservation if there are competing interests and competing needs.
I think the same. I think preservation is becoming like a little bit more of a villain in these scenarios than it used to be, and I think that. And mainly because it's so tied with maintaining the wealth and status of the status quo at the same time. Like, you know, San Francisco, I love its 3-story Victorian carpet that's all over that city, but it is fundamentally, that choice has fundamentally destroyed it as a city in a lot of ways, and it needs to be examined. And there are thoughtful ways to do it. I think that we're just smarter about using preservation and development in better ways, and I just want us to keep examining that. But I do think that we've kind of moved forward with the idea that we need to serve the citizenry as it exists now, instead of preserving, you know, like so much to the detriment of the current communities.
We'll take another one. Maybe Alex, you can.
Question from Amanda. Do you feel like there's any room for whimsy in design? Stuff that's fun and delightful and silly? Or do you feel like everything has to have a function first and foremost?
I'm pro whimsy.
Roman's a postmodernist. No, I am just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I'm enough of one to have that.
Yeah, I mean, I love things like the best stores, you know, that just went wild. And I don't know if everybody's familiar, but they kind of deconstructed the commercial box in various ways for this series of stores. And I don't know. I find a lot of joy in those sorts of things, but I also think there's a lot of intersection between the two
Yeah.
as well. Like you could have function that's also whimsical. I'm thinking of like rain chains, you know, for draining off of buildings, and all kinds of other, like putting like planters on the way down so the water like feeds into the planter, which is sort of a neat green thing, but also like a functional drainage system. I mean, there's a lot of room in between the strictly aesthetic and the strictly functional.
Yeah. And I think joy is a function in and of itself. So we should be in the business of joy.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's interesting though, because you know, you read your stories and the history and the kind of context you all provide about the emergence of some of these things. A lot of them come about because of these really sort of hyper, you know, pragmatic, almost boring things, you know, and they turn into these peculiar elements in the landscape. So I think it's an interesting thing to kind of ponder, you know?
I mean, I think that that's true. I mean, a lot of what we do is find joy in those peculiarities that come from, like, you know, tax regulation, you know, like that main buildings the way they are, and that provides its own joy. I don't know, like building in joy into intent, like, you know, like you have this sense of maybe it falls flat because it's trying too hard or something. I don't know, something you could see that, but you should definitely go for it. I mean, this is the art we live in. It should be good, you know, it should be fun.
Yeah, and I am a total nerd about these things like taxes and zoning and all these things, and how those constraints, like people working cleverly within those constraints have created amazing things. And so I lean towards saying if you can creatively react to constraints, in some ways that's better than just trying to manufacture joy out of thin air, because then it tells a story, right? Like you look at Paris and there's a story behind the mansard roof, right? And in some ways, you know, it managed to be both beautiful, but also to tell you something about the history of that city.
Yeah, in a way, it's not like a kind of technologically driven aesthetic or something like this. It's more of a kind of matter of fact, you know, I'm dealing with the water table kind of thing that motivates these kinds of things, you guys.
Agreed.
Maybe Phat, I think he's got a question for you.
Yes. I have a very popular question from David Sky, and they ask, thoughts on our failed Google Sidewalk Labs and the Toronto Waterfront Adventure. Smart city tech you look forward to, smart city tech you hope we all avoid.
I have to admit, I'm not like super, the particularities of that sort of interaction are not something I know perfectly well, but I can tell you this in the general sense, I guess, if that's what, I don't know, smart city tech, it's like interesting to me, but I just think it's one of those things that it's a huge trade-off, like the privacy and the information and the value of that is not something that should be entered into lightly. And I am interested in design solutions for things that are bold, you know, and interesting, like when it comes to the, you know, like wringing out the inefficiencies of cities and making them smarter. But I have to admit that my first sense of those things is that they make me they skeeve me out, I guess you might say.
I mean, it's funny, being around you, Roman, has actually really helped my skepticism bloom when it comes to these kinds of great leap forward visions. And I think it's really good to bring some healthy skepticism to them and be rigorous in evaluating things that aren't yet a reality, but people envision as a reality. The Hyperloop comes to mind.
Yeah, it's just stuff like that. Where it's sort of like there's sort of a technological solutionism that I think is a real problem. And I think that what I would love to see the next phase of cities be where the overriding ethic is the love of dull maintenance and not disruptive, you know, like great leaps forward. Just embrace dull maintenance of things, and that we care for things and we care for each other and we move things forward. for the right reasons, for issues of like of equity and accessibility, rather than, you know, like ease of use and convenience for the same people that cities were sort of designed for originally. And I think that's a very simple, I think it's much less interesting to people. And in a way, like it tells a different type of story than we typically have told about innovation and design in cities. And I really want us to spend some more time talking about the fact that cities are they're constant work, and we should just dig in and embrace that constant work.
Yeah, I think like, especially just like when you really start thinking about like also these like sort of like large projects and really like who is it actually being designed for, and like
it's the same people.
It's like it's just like, you know, like yogis and I don't know, namaste, you know, vibes. And it's just like it's always like this weird conversation of like, it's like, yeah, let's improve stuff, but in reality it's like, but who is it for? And then also kind of like why do we have to do this? But that always brings up to my mind.
But and so the one side of this that I would present the alternative side of this, or just in general, is that everyone I know involved in that project as a human is a really good human. Like I know tons of really smart and interesting designers, and they're just fascinated by solving problems, or fascinated by they don't see they were aware of the bigger issues, but they saw a greater good. And that's something I did see. Like I know just like smart, really cool people doing cool things. But I just think that interacting with a company when it comes to municipalities, I just believe in government in a different way than I believe in companies. And so there's a skepticism of government. I totally get it, but I have a greater skepticism of companies.
And there's also like a domain expertise issue, which, you know, architects run into a lot, right? Where like some architects think that they're urban designers, but they're not. And so it's like, you know, if you're an architect, the solution to everything is a building. But, you know, if the problem is the city, the solution may not be a building, right? And so part of it is just
certainly not an
tapping
app.
into, right? Well, yeah. I mean, so like if you're a technologist, the answer is technology, and I think that's a trap that a lot of professionals dealing with cities can fall into very easily, is thinking, you know, from the perspective of their own training and experience, and coming from a good place, but just not having the right tools and education to kind of tackle a particular problem.
You know, this sort of thing, these like these kinds of projects kind of skeeve me out as well, as a knee-jerk reaction, but maybe as like a counterpoint. I mean, you know, it's not really like the technologies, I think, you know, because with any successive kind of era of city building, there's been a new technology that emerged, and, you know, it's kind of the relationship between the designer and technology. Like when you're using a technology to deal with something, you know, that's just designing, you know, but when you're designing a technology, you know, designing something to kind of showcase the technology, that's when it starts to feel weird, perhaps.
Yeah, and it's usually the bad parts are about business. You know, like as alluded to earlier, like I used to study plant genetics, and most of the issues when it comes to like technology and agriculture are about bad business decisions and not about bad science. And so as science, a lot of these things are interesting and good and worth studying. As business, they need to be scrutinized.
Certainly. We've got a great, super direct, short question from Jack Felon. So pardon my mispronunciation, perhaps, but he asks, what is your biggest urban design pet peeve on the topic of urban design? Easy question.
I need to write these down, because I come up with them every once in a while when I'm asked, but I blank when anyone asks me anything like this. Urban design pet peeve. Okay. Kurt, go, Kurt.
Well, I don't know. I mean, this is in the realm. I don't know if it's an urban design pet peeve so much as an urban pet peeve, but you know, the scooter plague is real, and I'm actually like, I'm more pro scooter than most people I know. Like a lot of people just want them gone, and I think they have a place in cities. They have, in a multimodal city, they have a place, but that place is not parked in the middle of the sidewalk. And whether, it's up to urbanists to solve that problem and create better scooter parking, or it's up to the companies that are dumping scooters onto the streets to solve that problem, I don't know. But it's definitely a problem and it needs to be solved. And among other things, it's an accessibility issue, right? Like if you can't get down the sidewalk and around the scooter, that's a problem.
Yeah, I think mine is probably is something like that. I mean, my biggest urban design pet peeve is the thing that's impacting me in the moment that it's, like that I'm in a city doing something. So like I would say that, inscrutable parking signs are a huge urban design pet peeve. I think that cities should spend a great deal more effort knowing that they touch people in very specific ways at different times, and they should make those interactions smooth, even if they're not, you know, pleasant. Like for example, like I I used to drive downtown and park a fair amount. And I always got a ticket. I just always got a ticket. It's just a part of my life, and getting tickets are just part of my life. But the method of getting the boot off of your car is very smooth in Oakland. I've done it like twice. And I remember thinking, I was very happy with that interaction, even though it cost hundreds of dollars. And there was just something about it that was just like the person was nice. You took the thing off yourself. Like you can build good interactions out of restrictions and bad things. And something as thoughtless as a bad parking sign, you could make people love your city and take care of your city more if you spent more times in those moments of interaction with the populace. And so those annoy me.
I think we have maybe time for one more question. I don't know if this is going to be a quick one, but we'll try it out. So Shika Jagwani asks, you often speak of the gramification of spaces. Do you think this approach to creating urban space for the purpose of taking photos increasing tourism is sustainable, i.e. a good way to design public spaces?
Yeah. No, please.
I was just gonna say, I just wrote an article about these guerrilla gardeners in Prague who took this space across from a Frank Gehry building, and it was a park that had been trampled and turned brown. And during the pandemic, people weren't, showing up there anymore. So they took the opportunity to like till the soil and replant the place. And now you can see the desire paths forming where the grass has grown back, and you can see where people are walking. So you can think, oh, well, maybe we should put a sidewalk here. And there's so many things that I think are wonderful about that. But yeah. Roman, do you have
so I'm not a person who mediates the world through taking photographs personally. I'm just like not that well wired that way. I do think that people's interest in architecture has come a lot through photographs and photography, and I think that that's valuable. And it much like we were talking about earlier, like what is the worth of painting pictures on maintenance covers and things like that. It kind of has like a little bit of that. Like we can draft off of this, kind of fad and turn it into something valuable, because like maybe 1% of those people who love to take pictures of buildings because they make for good Instagram, maybe someone will become a great designer because of it, or pay attention to these things because of it. And so I think that that is valuable. I don't mean to be, I don't ever want to become like a crank to people who are like enjoying things, like enjoy things as you want to. I think that's perfectly great. I do think that kind of like that forced whimsy of like when you find an Instagram wall, like it when you see it. And there's something about that just feels hollow and feels silly. But again, that's not a huge harm there in that. You know what I mean?
Enjoy things so long as it's a manhole cover.
Well, no, I'm also okay with like the being the millionth person to pretend to hold up the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's the same
just
thing. Like we've done that forever. I
don't need to see it again, but you can go ahead if it brings you joy.
I used to, a friend of mine, when I lived in the city of San Francisco, he lived on Alamo Square. He's a photographer. And Alamo Square is that park where you see the Seven Sisters, which is like the seven Victorians, and you can kind of see downtown over that. It's the Full House opening credits image, of the. And when he saw people taking a picture of it, he would give them his card and ask them to send him a picture of it. And this is before, I mean, this is barely, it's internet existed, but there was not like photographic internet, like Flickr maybe was existing a few years later. And then he did a gallery show of all these people's identical picture of these of this shot. And it was so funny to me that people travel all this way and have all these individual experiences and want to take the same picture. This is just part of who we are. And I don't think Instagram created it. And I do think that we can take the good parts of that and have some fun with it. And the parts of it that are like too pandering and too silly, and like to have the different places. Los Angeles is full of these like places where you're supposed to stand and like you're supposed to Instagram that shot of this wall or this piece of architecture. Yeah, they're silly, but the harm is pretty minimal for the most part, and so it's just kind of part of the process.
And I have no idea how this would work, but I would love to see somebody try to harness that power for good, right? Like make it so that, when people pass through, they contribute something by their presence. I don't have the answer, so I'm asking that as a question to the audience, just something to think about.
Sounds like a good challenge for all the students watching. I could talk about this all night. I'm having such a good time.
Oh, me too. Thank you.
Alas, we do need to draw it to a close. So I'd like to invite Maddie Semiaticki, Interim Director from the School of Cities, to conclude our event.
Thank you, Michael. Good evening, everyone. I want to thank all our speakers, Roman Mars, Kurt Kohlstedt, Alex Sheinbaum, Ophelia Lan and Phat, and of course, Michael Piper for hosting our joint presentation of the 99% Invisible City, which was held in partnership between the School of Cities and the Daniels faculty. My takeaway from tonight was that this was a masterclass for all of us who do work on arcane things, on ordinary things, and dare I say, even boring things. Many of us, this is our life's work, and I think you gave Roman and Kurt, you gave us a masterclass on how to tell these stories in a way that's interesting and engaging and speaks to a wide audience. So I really want to thank you for that. And I would also just say your rapport that came across tonight is all over the book and all over the writing in the book and all over the way the stories are told in the book. For anyone who hasn't had a chance to pick up your own copy yet, you can get it at the U of T bookstore. You can get it at anywhere where you buy fine books and where fine books are sold. And finally, I understand that the event tonight is the end of a series, the end of Daniel's series, fall series. And to all the students, good luck with your final exams. Good luck with your final assignments. Thank you to all our audience for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.